Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that will work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable coaching to learn more.
Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Collin Stewart, and today I'm joined by L'areal Lipkins. She's the founder CEO at Lipkins Consulting Group, and I'm excited to have her on because we are talking about scaling up tribal knowledge. Why it doesn't work to just hire an AE and then expect them to listen to your calls and learn everything that you need to know, that they need to know in order to sell and close. L'areal, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited too. I've got a sneaky motivation for doing this episode, and that's that I'm 3 months into ramping up a new hire of my own. And I'll admit, I know sales fairly well. I was an AE for 10 years before I started this company. I'm 11 years into this company. And, you know, the number of AEs I've trained and ramped is not as many as I would have liked to. And the first couple that I did by osmosis, sit in, listen in on my calls. I mean, that's how I learned from Aaron when I was first learning how he sold consulting here at PR. And it wasn't exactly effective. So I'm curious to learn, to see what skills I can steal from you to brush up and help my AE transition. But if you haven't kind of figured it out now, today we're talking about scaling up knowledge, going from founder-led sales to hiring your first couple of AEs. So I think this is going to be super relevant if you are a new AE working for a founder, if you are a sales leader that's trying to do this for a founder where you're maybe one of the first couple hires, because this is something that is so often done poorly. And even if you're not one of those folks, I highly recommend listening in. I'm super excited to have L'areal on the podcast. She's got a ton of experience, and I think you can enjoy this episode. So that being said, why can't I just hire an AE, have them join me on my calls, listen, copy what I do, and then go from there? Like, why doesn't that should work, right?
Well, I was say you can do it, but it isn't going to work. Right? So there's a ton of people who do it. And a lot of times it's often because we're hiring out of necessity and people don't carve out the time to properly onboard and think about systems and processes. And one of the things I was sharing with you earlier, you know, if you hire someone in HR or accounting or operations, you have SOPs, you have standard operating procedures. And unfortunately, when it gets to sales, we're like, oh, it's just an art. It's just talk to people, be extroverted, make friends. And we don't think about the science behind selling. And so I'm a big believer that, you know, if you got one person doing it, that's one thing. But you get to 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 100. If you don't have something that is repeatable, it's not one, it's not going to be sellable. But the other thing, it becomes much, much more difficult to manage. If I've got 2, 3, 10 people selling 2, 3, 10 different ways, it's very difficult to even know what's working and what's not working. And so you spend a lot of time trying to manage these individual processes versus having one process that we document and we know that it works.
Mm-hmm. The scariest words I've ever heard other founders say to me is they're trying to grow revenue and they just hired 5 AEs.
Yeah.
And they don't come from a sales background. And I'm like, well, who's managing them? Who's building the process? And like, oh, yeah, they'll figure it out. I'll just keep the ones that work out. And I was like, you're going to be hiring 5 new AEs pretty soon.
Well, you know, and I think you bring up a great point, Collin, is that I've come into organizations where they hired sales people that were great account executives in previous roles, but they weren't responsible for building a process. So yes, they were very successful, but those processes were already built. And now they're bringing them in, expecting them to know how to build a process from scratch. And just because people can follow a process doesn't mean that they can build a process.
100%. I love going 0 to 1 and figuring out a new sale and all the things. Like, that is so much fun to me. Going from 1 to, just be repeatable, for the next, N years is not my favorite thing in the world. So I love that going 0 to 1. And I have had reps that hated going 0 to 1, that didn't like it at all. They're like, hey, just give me the script, give me the, give me the training, give me this, give me that, talking points, case studies, I'll learn those. And just, they were like Captain Consistency. They wash, rinse, repeat. Love it. Yeah. Great hires. That's not me.
Yeah. But the good thing is that it's not you, right? And I know we're talking a lot about going from 0 to 1 or 0 to 5, but even with the pandemic, right? There are a ton of organizations who were selling like crazy pre-pandemic, and since then their process has to change, right? Because the buyer may have changed, what they're selling may have changed, price may have changed, competition has changed, how they're selling has to change. So even those of you who are like, well, we have an established sales force, we have an established process, that doesn't mean that your process doesn't need to be optimized. It doesn't mean that your process still doesn't need to be updated and can benefit from a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today.
100%. And I think my favorite part of this conversation, especially from the pre-interview, was the focus on process. It is one thing. I mean, my early mentor, Joel, would hammer it into me. People, process, technology, in that order. Because people are literally your business. And then process is the firmware that you teach these people to run. And then technology is basically the stuff that you bring in, the tools that you bring in to enable the process. And if you do it backwards, you start with the technology, you end up with whatever the vendor said, whatever the this, whatever the that, you end up with the standard HubSpot deal outcomes or deal, whatever, the standard Salesforce opportunity stages. And you're like, oh, why do you use those? Oh, well, it's just what it came with Salesforce. It's like, okay, probably should have done the work ahead of time. So I'm a huge fan of the process piece, especially coming before tools. Before we jump into your specific process, because L'Areal has a great method for kind of walking through all the different steps and stages. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts. Tech, people, process, tech, in that order. Do you not care?
No, I think it makes sense, right? In terms of, you have to have the right people, because even if you have the wrong people with the right processes, it doesn't usually work out, right? So I follow a very similar process, right? And then we look at, do we have the right people? Do our people have the right skills? Do they have the right processes? And do we have the right culture in place to make it sustainable? So very similar approach to how you to philosophy.
Cool. We'll talk about the process for coming up with the process. We're coming up with the process and just kind of get more and more meta here.
It's like we should have the count for how many times we say process in this episode.
I was going to say, yeah, we'll watch this afterwards. We'll just take a drink every time somebody says process. So before we get into your process, can you walk me through what are the big chunks? What are the big steps or stages of your?
Yeah. So typically when we're working with the client, there's the overview of what we do, right? And so we like to start with strategy. Okay. When we're talking about strategy, we're talking about what's the go-to-market, who's our target, what needle are we trying to move? Sometimes it's a matter of shortening the sales cycle. Sometimes it's about increasing the dollar size. And obviously those processes can be different. So we talk big picture with strategy. Then we look at what are the stages that we need to have in the process. So you kind of joked about the default HubSpot, but I see it every single day where people buy Microsoft Dynamics or whatever CRM platform, and they just run with it. And then they wonder why it isn't working. It's because the stages need to be adapted to the way that you actually go to market. And then we do the steps within the process. And I'll tell you, Collin, this is where I would say 90% of sales teams fail, is that they have the big stages, but they don't have the steps within the stages. So excited to talk about that. And then we'll look at what are the scripts we need to have in place, and do our people actually have the skills to execute? Because you know how it is, right? You can train people, but if you don't actually have the skill to know how do I use this particular piece in real time or 5 different ways, depending on the scenario, it still doesn't work out, right? So they need to have the skills to be able to execute.
Totally. I think when I started listening to Aaron's calls, I had very brittle knowledge because I could repeat exactly what he had said, but I was just repeating. It was just rote memorization. I didn't understand it, and I didn't have the skills to replicate it or to kind of move left or right. It's like I can play a couple of guitar solos on the guitar, but I can't solo. I could copy somebody else's, I can learn it, but there's a very big difference between, playing this particular solo and knowing how to solo and just make it sound your own.
Absolutely. I love that analogy, right? Because I think that that's the thing is that I tell people we use the term scripts, but we really talk about framework. And so sometimes when I'm working with a team, they want to repeat it exactly the way that I'm saying it. I'm like, no, you need to understand the nuance as to why we're doing what we're doing, so that when you're in a certain scenario, you might say, okay, I need to shave this off a little bit, round this off a little bit for it to fit the context of the situation. And one of the things I'm pretty sure that you noticed as well, post 2020, is that the skills that people need now are a bit different, right? So I know I was actually on maternity leave when the pandemic happened. It was 5 days in to maternity leave when the world shut down. I got all my clients set up, I thought. But I've never been doing that, right? And you realize people who were traditionally outside sales people didn't have the skills to now do inside sales or to sell virtually or to sell hybrid. And so just because they had skills or they were established or veterans, pre-pandemic doesn't mean that they have the skills that are required to be successful in today's sales.
100%. So let's take it to the top and let's talk about strategy. When you say this is where you start, what is it that you're doing in the strategy step?
Yeah, so in the strategy step, we actually have an entire sales strategy conversation. So it's usually about 90 minutes to 2 hours. And we have 20 questions that we go through. And what is always interesting to me, and we usually have the CEO, president, sales leader, if they have one in place, is I find out of 20 questions, they are on the same page with about 20 to 30% of the questions. And we could spend 30 minutes just on who's our ideal client, right? Who is that ICP? What markets do we want to go after? And I find a lot of times people are shooting the net is too wide. And they think, oh, well, we can go after anybody or this particular industry. And it just creates more confusion versus going narrow and then go wide. So we spend a lot of time on getting the strategy right. Who's the target? What is our messaging? What is our value proposition? Where are people typically reaching out to us in the process? Are we prospecting? Have they already done some research, right? So all of that will gauge and really guide how we build out the rest of the process by understanding that. But that's where there tends to be the most misalignment. And if there's misalignment on strategy, it's just going to flow downhill.
It's no secret that predictable revenue does outbound for other companies. And it's one of the hardest things is if a client doesn't have strong convictions over strategy, or if they don't give us good guidance over strategy. If you're trying to sell, pharma software to farmers in Nebraska, might sound similar, but it's not going to work. And I've probably shared this example on the podcast before, but I had a client who I know the founder fairly well. And we worked with them for 6 months. We booked 56 meetings for them. And at the end, I was grilling his AE because I'm like, hey, this isn't working out. What's going on? Oh, well, we've never actually closed a customer like this in the segment that we had you targeting. We found out at the very end that this was just a market test. And it's like, well, why didn't we say that in the first place? We've been grilling ourselves over ROI for however long. And we would have said, hey, let's change it because you're rating us on ROI. But, we are not giving us something where, we could be ROI positive because you've never closed one because, case studies, this and that. And so everything else, it's sort of it's like a pyramid and everything else builds on top of this, base. If the base is shaky, nothing else matters. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization doesn't matter if I don't have food, water, shelter, Wi-Fi.
Absolutely. And I find, and a family you do too, this is where there's a significant gap, especially with startups, because they want to be all things to all people because they need to generate revenue. And I say, sometimes having so much opportunity is actually more of a distraction. There's all I'm really narrow and focused and getting some wins under your belt. Plus, it is much easier to have one process with one market than trying to sell to multiple markets or SMB and enterprise. Those are two completely different processes and two completely different strategies, right? As you can probably speak to. And so it's having that clearly defined is really important to be able to build everything else out correctly.
I love that. And so once we settle on, if I can sum it up, the strategy is really the ideal customer profile, which kind of defines who we're selling to at a company level, at a persona level, and then sort of which kind of is going to determine your available, I guess, the customer acquisition channels that you can afford to invest in, right? Because you've got your pricing in there. And then it's going to have your sales process that you're going to follow, because you're not going to follow an enterprise sales process for a $4,000 a year, right? And so it's kind of ideal customer profile, the money, the sales style or process. Is that fair?
Who are we selling to? What are we selling? How long does that typically take? What's our value proposition? Or is there already an incumbent, right? Are they already buying what you sell, but they're buying it from somebody else? And I know we have a similar client that we both work with, right? And
loves that guy.
And one of the things that with them is they sell customized solutions, and a lot of people that they're calling on are already buying the samples that they have on demand, right? So it's a totally different value prop, right? And so in working with them, I'm like, no, it isn't apples to apples, right? And so we had to change their whole sales process to help the prospect understand, and this isn't apples to apples, right? And so having that really laid out makes things a whole lot easier.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that we've been, and like for context, we share Brian. He's one of our case study customers. He was one of our early customers. Love Brian. Hey, bud, if you're listening. One thing that we found that, especially with startups, that we've had to like give them guidance on is like if you're taking the exact same strategy into a new market, you almost have to go back to product market fit, because product market fit is literally product and the market, and they fit together this way. But you're changing this half, and so you got to kind of rejig and figure out how to fit the product into the market. I'm not saying you necessarily always have to change the product. Sometimes you do, but you have to change the positioning or the way we sell it or the sales materials or, I'd say that probably the positioning is the biggest one that I think a lot of people miss when they're going into a new market.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great.
So we've got the strategy, who we're selling to, what it is we're selling, how we're taking it to market. What comes next?
Yeah, so once we get the strategy mapped out, the second thing that we do is we map out the large stages of the process, right? And this is where if you have a CRM, it's already probably pre-built in there, but it's really looking at your process, your strategy. What are those key milestones that we have to hit to say the deal is on track, right? And so this is where I would say most companies have something in place. It may not be the right thing. It may not be in the right order. They're probably not tailored, but they at least have something, right? Sometimes they have a poster on their wall, right, with it, or a little, little cheat sheets on their desk. But they have something in place. So usually we have to tighten it up. But this is where most people have something in place, and it's going to be one of those big milestones. So, for example, I have a client that's in the construction space, right? So one of their big milestones or stages is doing a site visit. And it's great to have that in their process. They know, just looking at the numbers and looking at the data, that when they can get a site visit scheduled within a certain amount of time, the chances of winning the deal go up. Right? So knowing that is a key milestone or a key stage, we built a process to say, how can we get the site visit as quickly as possible without compromising quality, right? And qualifying the opportunity. But again, that goes back to strategy. That goes back to looking at the data. And we realize, hey, this is a key milestone or stage in your process. Now, the other piece that we'll get into is then when we do a site visit, in this case, in this scenario, how do we actually run an effective site visit, right? This is where we actually get into the steps piece. And I would say this is where 90% of the time companies fail. They have the stages, they look good, they sound good, they need some tweaking, but they don't have the steps. They don't have the steps for how do we run a discovery call. They don't have the steps for actually how do we hand it off from an SDR or BDR to an account executive. They don't have those many pieces in place. And so what happens is they're looking at the big stages, but they're missing so much data because we don't know what's actually working within that stage and what's not working or what needs to be fixed.
And if you're an AE walking into a site visit and nobody's told you what to do on a site visit, you've only been in and watched your boss on a few, or, like I've been that guy, and you're like, okay, so what do I do now?
Yeah.
You're like, okay, let's have a chat. I know we're supposed to, shoot the shit a little bit. I brought donuts, talk about this, talk about that. And then it's like, do you have any work for me? Is there anything I can do for you? And you're like, that's the wrong question. And it's the wrong question. And you can see in the prospect's eyes, they're like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. You're like, yeah. So talk to me about maybe before I ask that question, just audience, if you are, I want you to just do a survey for me. Obviously, you're not going to tell me, but
yeah,
raise your hand if you have AEs that roll up to you. Now, keep your hands up if all of them if you think all of your AEs are using the stages in your pipeline in the exact same way without any variation. And I bet you most people put their hand down.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I mean, I see it all the time where it's like, we're reworking slide decks and like, oh, I don't use the slide deck. Oh, I can use the slide deck. Or they've created their own slide decks, right? And everything is completely different. And I know we're talking a lot about going from tribal knowledge to like really a more professionalized sales team. And that's one of the big things is that even if I have these stages, but everybody's doing the steps completely different, and I'm managing 5 people that are doing it 5 completely different ways,
awesome.
I'm frustrated because I don't know what's working and what's not working. They're frustrated because they don't know what's working and what isn't working. And if I'm the CEO, I'm frustrated because my team is probably behind on their numbers, right? More than likely. And we can't figure out what's not working. And so, what we do? Go do more. Right? And it's like, no, sometimes we need to get better at what we're doing before we get bigger, right? And so it's like really looking at one of the exercises we take our clients through is we have each person and the leadership team, sales leadership team, and even if they have some sales people, we have them put all the steps that they go through to close the deal, from initial conversation to closing the deal on Post-it notes. And we have everybody map out their processes, and they're never the same. I remember I was working with a commercial air conditioning company that was bringing me in for their kickoff. It's like, we just need to do a couple hours of training. And I was like, okay, well, let's start with your sales process. And they had 200 reps, Collin, and we had each one of them map out their sales process. And we had some that were like pages long, and we had one that said, I do whatever I need to do to close the sale. Like that was their process. Imagine trying to manage that many people. And obviously they're in different divisions, but you need to have, what are those steps that we do at each stage? What does a good discovery call actually look like? Who are we talking to? How do we kick it off? What questions are we asking? What information do we need to gather by the end of that call to say, yes, we should invest more time in this opportunity? And most organizations just don't think that grand.
100%. The thing that I love about your site visit stage, customer verifiable.
Yeah.
That level of clarity of like, do you have a site visit booked? Have you gone to a site visit? It is a tangible thing that you can verify with the customer, right? It is not I think that they're left-handed stage. I would not recommend that as a pipeline stage, unless you're selling like left-handed scissors. But most of us lefties probably learned to use right-handed scissors, so it's an irrelevant step.
Yeah.
But I love that the site visit, customer verifiable, like something actually physically happened. I'm curious, is that something you do for all of your stages?
No, it depends on what the sell is, right? Because selling SaaS, the SaaS product is very different than my clients that do commercial construction, right? So not everything will be customer verifiable. However, I think you bring up a good point going back to your people, process, technology, that you mentioned earlier, is then going into your CRM and having those stages and then having those steps built in. And so, and I love doing this because when we get into managing the pipeline, and you've probably seen this too, where you sit in a pipeline meeting and everyone is going through the opportunities and like, oh, I think I got 50% chance of closing and 60 and 70 and 90, and it's completely arbitrary. Versus with this approach, as the deal is moving through and as we're gathering information and as we're doing things, that's the probability is increasing. But it's based on a fact, it's based on data, it's based on things that actually move the needle. Versus I just got the gut feeling that when I've met twice and we both went to the same college that I'm going to close this deal. Like it just doesn't work that way. And so we leverage technology that way to get some more accuracy into not only managing the opportunity, but then looking at pipeline and forecast.
Love it. And so once you've agreed on these are the stages, and it sounds like, I think you mentioned roundtable in kind of the strategy session. The next step is like, okay, let's see let's get the AEs involved. Let's see what their process is. Then I guess, how do you come to a conclusion on what are the right set of steps? Because if you're asking everybody and everybody's got a different method, well, then you're going to get 30 different you got 5 AEs, you're going to get 5 different versions of the pipeline. How do you decide what the right steps are?
So great question. So part of it is figuring out what stuff actually moves the needle. Like there may be things that I do that works for me, but it isn't necessary for me to do. Right. And so one of the things that people say, well, I do this and then I do this. Well, we're going to, in a process, we want to do the required things. So there may be additional things that you might do in your process because it fits your personality, but we're looking at what are the things that we must do to move the needle. And so that usually allows us to be able to filter that out. Is this relevant? Is it not relevant? Is this a need to have or a need to have process? And then also, when we roll out a new process, we track it for 90 days after. Right? So we track it for 90 days, and then we come back and we refine it even more. But that's how we typically narrow it down. And to your point, if I had a team of 30, I don't want everybody's opinion. Right? So this is where we typically start with the leadership team, and then we'll bring in some handpicked people if we need some boots on ground perspective.
Running that meeting and getting everybody's feedback from 30 different AEs is one of my nightmares. Like I don't know. I don't know if I would survive that.
Yeah. Well, a quick exercise that your audience can do, look at the last 5 deals that you closed that were smooth. Map out what happened in that deal. Look at the last 5 deals that you thought you were going to close with a lot of time investing. It took forever. The bunch of speed bumps. And you still didn't close it, what was missing in those deals? And things will start to pop out. Oh, I wasn't talking to the right person. This was a need. This was a want, not a need. They didn't have budget. They had never tried an alternative solution, right? You start to figure out where the gaps are. So that's a quick exercise that anybody that's listening today can do.
I love that. I haven't done that in so long. That used to be something I did with every customer. I would do first 5, last 5 for new founders, like with Brian. I did first 5, last 5. So tell me about the first 5 deals you ever closed, because I'm trying to get like ideal customer profile and like what was good, what was not good, where did they come from, and then the last 5, which tells you sort of where they are now. You can kind of see the delta of the journey, kind of fills in the gaps. I love that. So we've talked.
Sometimes it's going back to basics, right?
100%. Because it's so easy to just, if you're founder, CEO, or like first time sales leader or sales leader at a new startup, there are so many changes. It's a full job, whether you're an AE or a sales lead, it is a job that could take 150% of your time.
Yeah.
And there's always this pressure, and it's hard to justify taking a step back and looking at the process, because looking at the process isn't going to help me hit my quota this month or this quarter, but it probably will help you do better next quarter, next year, and relax more and earn you some more time. So it's always just kind of a funny trade-off.
Yeah. It's one of those old classics. Sometimes you have to slow down to speed up.
Totally.
And I find that, especially just in the revelation between the 5 that closed really easy and the 5 that were just a lot of work, and people typically still don't end up closing. There's so many ahas that happen, And usually, and you probably see this too, it's small tweaks. Like it's not like we have to change everything. It's our steps are out of order. We're talking to the wrong person. We're talking to the right person, but the messaging is off. It's these small tweaks that become really apparent that when you're in the day-to-day grind of trying to meet your numbers, you're going to miss. But when you slow down and say, okay, let's really evaluate this. I actually did this with one of Brian's reps. She had a deal with coaching her, account executive. She had this deal that was like $30K that she had been holding on. And you know how it is. You keep investing time and you don't want to let it go. And it was taking forever. And I was like, for the love of God, just let it go. It's done. You're not going to close it. And the big eye opener for her was that she had a $40 million deal that closed in like 2 weeks, which is, and you know, the world was like unheard of. And I said, okay, let's look at these two deals. You got a $30,000 deal that we've been talking about for 45 days. And you got a $250,000 deal when they originally told you they had a $100,000 budget and it closed in 2 weeks. What was the difference? And it was startling for her, I think. And like for me, I'm like, told you. But the just stark contrast between those two opportunities, I think it made her see this was a red flag, this was a red flag, this is a red flag. I need to find more. And so I really encourage your listeners to just do that simple exercise because I think they'll start to see, oh, here's the small tweaks that we need to make that actually have a big impact. They can have material impact the next month, next quarter, and beyond.
Love that. And so we've settled on the strategy, who we're selling to, how we're selling it. We've walked through the stages in the process. What the next step is steps in each stage.
Yeah.
How do we come up with those? Do they typically exist, or if they don't exist, how do you go 0 to 1 with?
Yes, they typically don't exist formalized, right? They may have like, this is kind of my approach, and then this is where we're distilling, like we're looking at the deals that closed, the deals that didn't close, or we're bringing in the AEs to kind of interviewing them and looking at their process to see what are the right steps. And then not only what are the right steps, but then do we have the right steps in the right order? So that's kind of that whole piece that we just talked about, really takes care of the steps piece. And then that's where we then move into, now that we have the strategy, the stages, the steps, what are we actually saying in the call? And this is where we start mapping out the framework. And I will tell you, Collin, this is where I tend to get pushback. Because we say, a good salesperson just knows how to sell. All right, I don't want to have to micromanage. I just go out there. But then when you hear reports that 57 to 60% of the sales process, people are already through before they're even engaging with the salesperson, that means that your prospects are armed with more knowledge about who you are, what you do, your competitors, and they're much further in the process. So if you are not preparing your team with the right things to say, when to say, how to say with the right process, you're actually doing a disservice not only to your team, but also to your process. Right. So,
and I'd argue it's not a team.
What did you say?
I'd argue it's not a team, right? Like teams play together. And if you have 5 independent salespeople doing 5 independent processes, it's not a team. It's a collection of individuals doing their own thing. A team plays together. A team practices together. A team follows the same playbook. And that's what a real sales team does. That's what a real team does. And if you're not doing that, you're not a real team.
Absolutely. Right. And I think it becomes difficult to manage. It becomes difficult to lead. It becomes very difficult to coach. Right. And so even how you mentioned the term playbook, I'm a big believer that you need process, and then you have your playbook that includes your process and other places. You have your office strategy, et cetera. But if you don't have your core foundation of a process, it becomes very difficult to run those plays, right? To use that terminology, but it also becomes very difficult to coach, right? So I talk a lot about the difference between training people and then coaching people. So training is, I'm going to teach you what to say, when to say, and how to say it. So you and I both know, just because I teach you when, what, and how, doesn't mean you have the gut to actually do it. Right? And that's where we then get into the coaching. But that becomes very difficult to do if I don't have a process that I'm following, because I can't identify where the gap is actually
Mm-hmm. It's like trying to navigate without a map.
occurring. Correct. So I love the script piece because I do a lot of what we call self-call audits, right? So we roll out the process, they're doing their calls, and then we're listening in, and we don't listen live, we get the recordings, and then we're actually able to go back and say, okay, hey, Collin, here's what you did well, and here's what you didn't do well, and here's the gaps, what do you think? But it's having those scripts, and again, we actually use the term framework because we're not trying to create robots. We want to have people add their own personality, but we need to have the core essence and consistent messaging.
100%. I'm curious on your call audits, because we do call scoring as well for both cold calls and for discovery calls, or any of the AE calls, are we a fit, discovery, whatever you want to call it. How do you, when you look at a call, what are if you don't mind us going a little bit deep into this process, what are the elements, what are the factors that you're looking for and kind of scoring them on?
Yeah, so great question. So part of what we're looking for is, are we actually following the process, right, that we have mapped out? So if we're working with a team that has XDRs or BDRs, then what we're looking for them is obviously a little bit different than what we're going to be looking for AE on that initial discovery call and deep dive call. So we're looking at, are we following the process? The other piece that we're looking at is more like nuance. Someone might be following the process, but the execution of it is poor. Right, so we're listening to their tonality. We're listening for the things that they missed. We're listening for how confident were they in what they were saying. We're listening for, are they controlling the call, or are they letting the prospect lead the call and take control? So it's we have different scorecards for each individual organization, but overall, those are some of the things that we're listening for when we're on a call, especially on the SDR side. For the account executives, right, we're more listening for, it depends on if they're doing that handoff from that initial call. How was the handoff from SDR to account executive? And then, we're going based on their process. How did they set up the call? How did they qualify the opportunity? What were the pain points that they identified? And we have a whole process for that. Just they set a clear next step at the end of the meeting if it makes sense. Right, so there's different milestones that we're listening for.
I love that. Yeah, that's pretty closely to what we do.
Yeah.
In fairness, I didn't have to, I had a running start because we had help with a client of ours a long time ago, Burgal Sagemont. We worked with a bunch of their portfolio companies, and I think still do every now and then. But they had this like perfect call that they want everybody to get to, and we kind of worked with them on like building out this call scoring framework. They mostly had, a good chunk of it, and then we kind of helped optimize it a little bit, and we've stolen that from them and then modified it for cold calling. So I was literally working on it last week. That's why I was kind of curious to see how our processes overlap here.
One of the things, and I don't know if you see this in your world, but since we're talking about it, I think it's a huge opportunity for a lot of your listeners is actually listening to their calls. I find that a lot of companies don't listen to them. Let's say a sales manager or CEO doesn't listen to them, or they listen to them and say, okay, right, but there is no scorecard, there is no benchmark, there is no coaching conversation that they have with the rep to take that insight from that call, improve, and then implement it on another call. Or if they are doing that, they don't close the loop on the conversation where it's actual coaching and I get better. And so I think that's a huge opportunity. Sometimes they're recording the calls or not actually listening to them. Or we're listening to them, but we don't have the right coaching conversation to take the feedback from that call to implement their future call.
Totally. When I'm managing, like when I'm a full-time sales manager, I like to do two types. I like to do a call review and a call scoring session. And the call scoring is like, I'll listen offline without the rep there, 2x, 3x speed, and just kind of go, okay, high points, here are my 7 kind of factors. I'm going to score them 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. But then I'll score that and kind of provide like, okay, here's the one thing that I think you could have done to improve. But then I also like to do call review where I get reps to bring me their worst call or like anything that they want to work on. And so it's a little bit of like top down, here's what I think, and a little bottoms up, here's what they're looking for help on. And I found doing both of those helped me kind of meet in the middle of, it's not just always me telling you, you did a shitty job on a call,
Absolutely.
and it's, so you get a little bit of that, and then you can give them a chance to like self-identify, here's where I want help.
You know what I love? Like conversations like this is how aligned we are. So even when I do call reviews, I have a client where they have 125 reps and they work with associations, digital marketing for associations. And the sales reps hated doing call reviews because basically I walked to the meeting and I walked out saying like, can I really do this? Like, that's where you suck is what they were telling them, right? Or they would give them, Collin, there's 10 things you need to do different. And now I'm like, where do I start? And so one of the things that we did, because they were already doing call reviews, is we changed it where the reps, our process is kind of one and the same. So they score the call and they do call review at the same time, and the reps score themselves on the same area. And our process is simple. What do you think worked? What didn't work? What would you do differently? And so the rep now debriefs themselves first, and then their manager gives them the feedback, and then at the end they decide on the things they want to focus on in between their next session. So very similar process. We just combined it. But I think one thing I want to make sure your listeners take away is making sure that the rep debriefs themselves and reviews themselves is incredible. Because one, it helps them see and helps you see, are they self-aware? One. And then two, where is there alignment between our perspectives on that call and where are we misaligned between our perspectives of the call? And that may be a good indicator where they need more training and or coaching.
100%. It's one of my favorite parts of looking at them, and to see it's the piece where I learn the most about where the rep is. Because when you're looking at them and you're like, okay, I look at this call and I can see, the 7 things that I would do differently. I want to see what they see. And when they're only pulling out 1, or if they're pulling out 5, you're in a very different spot. Mm-hmm. So I think it's one of my favorite. It's not that it's a trap. You definitely don't want to trap and be like, I found 7, you found 1, but it helps you learn kind of where they're at. And yeah, there's like that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You want to start with like the base level things first before we get into like, the micro adjustments.
Yeah. So we get into scripts, and then the last stage that we get into, our last piece of the process is skills, right? And this is the training. And when most people reach out to us, they just want, I'm going to say 50% of people that reach out to us are looking for process. They know something isn't working, but they don't know what's not working or how to fix it. The other half is we just want some training, right? And you and I both know just training people isn't going to stick. It's not going to be sustainable, and it's not going to scale, because when that person leaves, that training leaves with them. Mm-hmm. But when you have the right processes, you can add people and the process still works. So the training is the last piece where we're talking about what are those nuances, what are those micro adjustments that we need to focus on so that they can fully execute the process at 100% or close.
I find one of the biggest gaps in talking to people is the lack of onboarding for their new AEs. It's like,
what is onboarding? We hire them and you go sell. Oh, there's a process in between.
Yeah. It was really insightful. Getting a chance to see both folks in the SaaS community and how people with unlimited budgets would hire and invest, and then how people with tighter budgets, outside of the tech world, would do it. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I think the right or wrong probably exists somewhere in the middle where you're not too much, you're not too little. I'm curious, what does a good onboarding process look like to you?
Yeah, I typically do a baseline of 90 days, right? Now, if I have a client, like I have clients in the aviation space, it's a much longer ramp up time for them. But typically our go-to is, what's your 90-day plan? And so we will help them build out their 90-day when they're onboarding someone. What are your expectations? What do they need to know and be able to do at the end of 30 days, end of 60 days, end of 90 days? And then we backfill the training, right, to align with that. So what do we need to train them on in the first 30 days so that they know what they need to do and they can actually execute. But 90 days is kind of the gold standard for organizations that have a longer sales cycle or a much more complex sell will go up to 6 months. I had a client, for example, that they kept reps on for a year. And they said, we dedicate a year to fully ramping them up, which in that case was too long, way too long, because they literally would not fire somebody in the first year.
Well, imagine being that rep. I'd be so bored.
Yeah, right. And I was like, the first thing that we have to do is, and I think their intention was good, right? Their intention was if someone isn't succeeding in the first year, we're responsible for that. But we're fixing the wrong issue. What we need to be figuring out is why are people not succeeding? How do we fulfill those gaps? And we should know that in the first 3 to 6 months, not at 12 months when they're struggling, and we both know it isn't a good fit.
Love that. I mean, you can appreciate they were trying to solve the problem just with, term instead of getting in and doing the work.
Yeah. So which is why they hired us, right? Was to look at their onboarding process and then put training in place. And then the big gap was the manager. How do we train the managers? If we put onboarding in place, but then they hit the floor with managers who are just like, and forget the whole process. I just need you to put numbers on the board. And so, okay, we're going to have an issue here. Right? And so that goes back to that whole piece about strategy and alignment. This obviously is a much bigger organization than a startup. But strategy becomes even more important the bigger you get. Because now you have different departments and SDRs and BDRs and account executives and CSMs who might all have their own strategies and they may not be aligned. Right. And so that definitely impacts the customer journey as well as turn.
100%. It's like spending $500,000 on your sailboat to kit it up to go offshore, but not investing at all in navigational tools so that you know precisely where you're going. You've got this really expensive boat, you've got all these processes, you've got all the cool and fancy gear, but you're sitting in the boat, you're in the water, you're like, I don't know, do we go west? Man, that boat is not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. And what was really interesting about that particular client, I see this across the board, which is why I want to share it, is most times people think the issue is the people. Our new hires, our reps, our SDRs, our account executives. Very rarely do they come and say, we have a management issue. Right? Or we have a process issue. And 99% of the time, there's usually a management issue and a process issue first. Because I say, well, who hired these people? Who manages these people? Oh, you do. You did. Right? And so that piece is going to be really important is having a process is the foundation. But you also have to have a strong leader or founder or CEO that's managing that holds people accountable, that understands sales, that has the skills to coach and train for the process to be the most effective.
I love that. I wanted to, I have so many more questions that I could ask, but I want to kind of bring it to a close here.
Yeah.
I think we've kind of hinted at it a couple of times already, but can you talk to me about the impact that, good process that you've seen good process have on a sales cycle or on a sales team or a sales cycle?
Yeah, I would love to share. Obviously, when you have a good process, there's the benefit to the reps themselves, right? I'm more confident. Every deal isn't recreating the wheel. There's also a benefit to the manager that now I'm not managing 5 different processes, right? So I can be more consistent in how I'm approaching it. I can be a lot more effective at ramping up a new hire because I have a specific process for them to follow. I can be a lot more effective when it comes to training and coaching and develop people, where now I'm managing the processes, but I'm developing people versus just trying to manage people. And then obviously there's benefit to the organization where we're shortening the sales cycle. We are increasing the dollar size. We're increasing profitability. We keep mentioning Brian, but one of the things that he came to me, his big issue was process, right? That he hand off from SDR to account executive. And one of the things that he said, because we were doing a case study interview, And he said, when you came in, you changed the process that easily added $400,000 to $500,000 in the first year to the bottom line. Having the right process in the right order. Right? And he had a lot of the things. Brian, he had a bunch of data. He had the stages, but the stages weren't in the right order and the steps weren't clearly defined, therefore people weren't actually following. But once we added more clarity to it, then it was more consistent. People were bought into it, and it just changed. No longer were they discounting. No longer were deals taking forever to close. No longer were they apples to apples. They could really lean into their value proposition. And the sales cycle short. Right? So there's so many benefits from an individual perspective, to management perspective, to organization perspective, to having an optimized process in place. And then obviously there's the benefits to the client, right? Because we're respectful of their time. If it isn't a fit, we both decide that early on, we move on, and we're not wasting a lot of time only to find out that it's not a mutual fit.
Totally. The reading between the lines, my people aren't going to listen. I'm not willing to make changes. I just wanted to pay for some training and tell my boss that things will get better.
Yeah.
But I don't actually want to change anything.
Yeah.
Cool. I love the conversation. Talk to me about the type of work that you all do with Lipkins Consulting Group.
Everything we just talked about. No. We really focus
Three's
on
payments of $99.95.
Yes, the all the above. So really, we focus on two core pieces. One is sales process, right? That is our bread and butter. Is looking at people's processes, optimizing it, and/or building it from scratch. And then the second piece of that is then actually doing some training. So there are times where we do training only. We don't tend to do a lot of that. Because we want to make sure that it sticks, but we really focus on sales processes, training, and not only training sales people, but really training sales managers to be leaders. And that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day, but that's our core two pieces: sales process and sales training.
Interesting. And if people are looking to get in touch, we'll put a link to your website, which is l'areallipkins.com, in the show notes here. But what's the best way for them to get in touch? Through the website, through LinkedIn?
Through the website, through LinkedIn. I think also if you found this conversation helpful today, I also recently wrote a book. I know you're writing in the process of writing a book yourself, but my book is called What Top Performing Salespeople Do Different. And it really dives into the 10 different things that high performers do on a consistent basis to be successful, regardless of what's happening in their industry and/or economy. So you can check that out on Amazon as well.
Love it. L'areal, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure. I could keep going. Love the conversation. It's always good talking to like-minded people. But there's also some areas that we vary, which is also interesting to me as well.
I love that. I think there's this conversation definitely warrants a part 2. And let's get in touch and keep talking about that.
Yep, make it happen.
Right on. Thanks for coming on. Everybody, thanks for listening. We'll see you all next week.